Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. This episode is a direct follow-up to the previous one on spiritualism, and it's going to be the last on the subject for a while. We've been hitting this subject very hard over the last few weeks, and this is kind of the end of it. And it's because the topic of the day, Houdini, he's the man who really drove that death blow to that second wave of spiritualism which came around post-World War I. Houdini is most famous for going on a crusade against fraudulent mediums who were literally just bilking people out of their money during this era. But this crusade really happens at the end of his life, so let's do what we always do. Let's start at the beginning. Because Harry Houdini is without a doubt one of the most fascinating characters of the early 20th century. The man is an urban legend in his own right. So, the man we know as Harry Houdini, the man who we associate immediately with magic, escape artistry, and danger, was actually born Eric Weiss on March 24th, 1874, in Budapest, the Kingdom of Hungary, aka Austria-Hungary. He was born in a Jewish family. His father was a rabbi named Mayer Samuel Weiss, and his mother was a lady named Cecilia. And his mother would go on to play a significant role in his life because Eric, aka Harry, he was a total mama's boy. Some people state that everything he did in order to not only impress, but in order to take care of his mother. She seemed to always be first in his mind. So in 1878, when Harry's about 4, I'm just going to call him Harry, even though he wouldn't take that name till later in his life. So his family arrives in America, and they're part of that Eastern European wave of immigration that came in the late 19th and early 20th century, Jewish peoples being amongst the largest group of that. And a lot of them are coming from these Slavic areas. So the first few years they're living in Appleton, Wisconsin, where his father served as a rabbi of the Zion Reformed Jewish congregation. However, in 1882, Rabbi Weiss, he loses his job as a rabbi. It's not really stated as to why. A lot of modern historians say that he was just a failed rabbi, but it was known that his father was very ill. He eventually dies of cancer, so it could be that he was just too ill to perform his duties as rabbi. However, after this, the family quickly falls into poverty. By 1887, they pretty much wash up in New York, where they're living in a boarding house on East 79th Street. And young Eric, Harry, at 8 years old, drops out of school, and he's doing all these odd jobs. He's mostly like shining shoes and stuff. And by the time he's 9, he makes his debut as a trapeze artist, calling himself Eric the Prince of the Air. This was most likely on Coney Island, which at the time, and is still today, famous for freak shows and magic acts and trapeze artists and all the kind of stuff you think of when you think of a carnival. I mean, we basically all know what Coney Island is. It's a big amusement park. And it's in this atmosphere where he decides he's going to dedicate his life to basically being a magician and performing these, like, strongman feats. Because we got to remember, Houdini, he only stood like 5'5", 5'6". He was not a very tall guy, so he had to do something to stand out. And his way of standing out was to basically do these challenges, these endurance challenges, and these strength challenges. And at the same time, he's reading this book by this French magician known as Houdin. And this book basically becomes his Bible. He learns everything he can learn about this magician and his tricks, and how to perform these tricks. And these are mostly close-up magic tricks, sleight of hand, card tricks. The classic stuff like make the ball under the cups disappear or pick a card. And in 1891, he does his first real magic show. It's basically in a tent alongside this strong man at, I guess, a dime show. And it's really where he gets his start. It's on this circuit of sideshows and dime shows and freak shows and traveling circuses. And not only is he doing this close-up magic, these card tricks and stuff, he actually bills himself as the king of cards. He's also doing strongman acts, and at one point he's doubling as a wild man in a circus. And it's in these initial phases of this magic career in the early 1890s, 1891, 1892, where he comes up with his moniker Harry Houdini. Now, we all know the famous story Houdini is just Houdin with an I because in French it means like Houdin. But what a lot of people don't know is the name Harry, it comes from a man named Harry Keller, who was another magician that he admired, so this was his way of paying homage to him. However, this close-up magic, these card tricks and stuff, it really wasn't his forte. I mean, he was good at it, but he didn't really stand out. A lot of other magicians at the time said that he kind of lacked the grace and finesse required to have achieved excellence in that craft. And being bound by these limitations, this is when he starts experimenting with escape acts. But throughout the 1890s, he's basically working this carnival sideshow circuit. Now, initially, he's performing this stuff with his brother Theodore, who acts as his stage assistant. However, in 1894, he meets the second love of his life, his wife, Bess. She was 18, he was about 20. It was said it was love at first sight, and they were married within, I think it was like 3 months. She became his assistant and stagehand for the rest of his life. Now, at this time, he's still working for basically starvation wages. He's a competent professional magician, but he's just like everybody else. He's not really famous. He hasn't done anything to really break out yet. It's not till 1899 when he gets his big break, and it actually happens because he's performing this handcuff escape trick in front of his manager, and his manager was so impressed by it that he tells him, dude, you just need to start focusing on these escape acts, because that's where the money's gonna be at. So his manager books him on the Orpheum vaudeville circuit. Now, this is kind of that stepping stone to the big times, because the Orpheum vaudeville circuit, it was this circuit of theaters all across the country. And remember, this is pre-Hollywood, or the very infancy of Hollywood. Vaudeville was where it was at. It's where you were discovered. It's where you became famous. And within months after getting onto the vaudeville circuit, he's performing at some of the best vaudeville houses in the country. The next year, he gets a European tour. And his European tour almost doesn't take off because nobody's heard of this guy. So what they do is they arrange this little stunt where he basically goes to Scotland Yard and he's like, give me your toughest, most unbreakable handcuffs and I'll escape them. To which they do, and he does. And the newspapers are there, and he is instantly shot into fame. The police there are baffled. They're like, how did he get out of these handcuffs? This is amazing. This guy is awesome. This directly leads to a booking at the Alhambra Theatre of Variety in the West End of London. This was a very posh, elite kind of theater. And his performances there were so successful that he was making $300 a week, which is the equivalent to $11,000 in today's money. To be honest, I would love to make $11,000 a week. That would be freaking awesome. So at this point, he's made it. He's starting to make a reputation for himself. But he has this drive, and it's this drive that really makes him the best to always outdo himself, always one-up himself. And I'm sure that quest for fame played a little bit into it, because he starts performing all of these acts kind of out there in the public for everybody to see. And he famously will do them in front of newspaper offices. His team would go into a town and they'd plaster up all these posters with Houdini, the great escape artist, and then they'd build up all this hype, and then he'd come into town and go to the local police station or whatever and break out of their handcuffs. He would challenge people to create sets of handcuffs that he couldn't escape from, and he always escaped from them. And then he started getting into things like chains and straitjackets. Now, in the early days when he's escaping from the straitjackets, he would usually go behind a little curtain and a little box and escape from the straitjacket. And then he'd emerge with the jacket in his hand, and it was a big hit. But his brother comes up with the idea of removing the curtain. He basically says, hey, Harry, it's kind of boring just watching a curtain flop around. How about we get rid of that curtain and really show them your struggle to get out of this straitjacket? It'll build tension and suspense, and the people will love it. And Harry's all like, dude, this is why I keep you employed. Yeah, let's do that. And before you know it, the stunts start getting wild. They're getting crazier. The one famous one where he is hanging upside down in a straitjacket in front of a newspaper building in, I believe it's New York, in front of a huge crowd. That's a big hit. These stunts where he's like diving off of buildings and off of piers covered in chains into freezing cold water, that becomes a big hit. He also performs an escape attempt outside of Moscow where he's like, I guess, handcuffed and shackled and thrown into the back of this Siberian transport van. And he's basically saying that, okay, if I can't get out of this, I'm basically traveling all the way to Siberia in the back of this van where the only key is kept. And he's just at this point starting to become a superstar. And a lot of this is through the hype he builds and the advertisement from his teams that go in, and they, like I said, they'll put up the posters and bill it as the greatest escape ever. It's like, come see the world's greatest escape artist escape from a jail cell, or escape from the strongest chains and handcuffs in the world. And every time he's ramping it up. He's ramping up the danger, he's ramping up the challenge, because for one, people like to be challenged, but for two, he was getting a lot of imitators. Now, they say imitation is the finest form of flattery, but when the fans stop coming to your shows and start going to the imitator shows, that's where you have to realize, okay, I gotta step it up. I gotta be better than this guy. And in 1906 is when he kind of starts to ramp things up. For one, he gets interested in film and he starts allowing these new cinematographers to film his escapes and his feats. But it's also said that in 1906 is when he really starts the initial planning phases of his next big thing, the infamous milk can escape. And it's probably around this time where he's really preparing himself. He's learning how to hold his breath for long periods of time underwater. I think his record was like 3 minutes and 45 seconds. And the dude is always in peak physical condition. This is a guy who would like run 5 miles a day, who would constantly challenge himself and push his body to the absolute limits. So basically how this act works is Houdini, he's handcuffed and he's placed in this oversized milk can, and it's filled to the tippy top with water. It's then usually locked from the outside with padlocks or chains. In some modifications, he goes a little further. He even puts the can inside a wooden chest, which is then locked with padlocks. And then the curtain drops, and then Houdini emerges free from the water can, just narrowly escaping drowning. And this is one of the first of a bunch of his feats which really involve water or the possibility of drowning. He seemed to be somewhat fascinated with overcoming this idea of drowning. You know, we'd see these stunts where he'd jump off of bridges while chained up, and we would see other great tricks, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But they all involve water, and it kind of comes back to an apocryphal tale. We don't know if it's true or not, but the tale basically goes that when he was about 5, he nearly drowned in a lake. And overcoming that experience of nearly drowning really drove him to, I guess, face that fear of drowning. And I hear that that's a thing that a lot of magicians will do. A lot of their magic involves stuff that they're afraid of, so they're trying to overcome that fear. However, Houdini, he would only go on to do this milk can trick for about 4 years. It was very quickly being imitated because he wasn't really the only one working on this trick at the time. There was actually lawsuits that came out over who came up with this trick first. And even though it didn't last very long during his career, he's the one that it primarily becomes associated with, and it's generally believed that he's the one that came up with it. And to be honest, his brother, who was always there with him by his side, Theodore, who was also a magician, he performed this feat well into the 1940s. So at this point, he's on top of the world, and in 1909, he travels to Paris, and he releases another film. It's a lost film today, but it shows a bunch of his feats and escapes and some underwater escapes and stuff. But it's also in 1909 when he cements his name into Australian history. During this year, he becomes very fascinated with this new emerging technology, aviation, and he decides he wants to partake. So he buys a French voice-on biplane for $5,000, and he actually learns to fly this thing. So in 1910, he's on his Australian tour, and he brings his new airplane with him. And on March 18th of that year, he completes one of the first powered aeroplane flights ever made in Australia. He actually does 3 flights this day at a place called Digger's Rest in Victoria. Now, these flights are very short. One of them was as short as a minute. I think the longest one was 3.5 minutes, but he went a total of like 2.5 miles. At one point, he actually manages to reach 100 feet in the air, but it's a big success. He is the first person to ever fly in Australia. On March 20th and March 21st, he makes a total of, I think, 4 other flights. I think the longest one lasted 7.5 minutes. And Houdini stated that in the future, he was going to do more flights and even perform a stunt where he falls from the airplane or suspended from the airplane, does a handcuff escape. However, after this Australian tour, when he gets back to the States, he basically stores the plane away and he never touches it again. I don't know if he loses interest or if something happened that freaked him out, but that basically becomes the end of his flying career, which is okay because he's still the greatest magician of all time at this point. I mean, at this point, he's basically the highest paid vaudevillian performer out there. However, he still has to top himself, so in 1912, he introduces his most famous trick ever, the Chinese water torture cell. In this trick, Houdini's feet were locked in stocks and he was lowered upside down into a tank filled with water. Now, the tank had a glass front, so you could clearly see him being lowered down into it. And this is part of the act because on each side would be 2 of his assistants standing there with sledgehammers ready to break that glass in case something were to go wrong. Because, that possibility that he could die during these stunts was always there, at least in the minds of the audience. So basically he'd be lowered to the cell, everything would be locked up, the curtain would drop, and then he would emerge victorious from the cell, narrowly defying death. And this is one of those tricks where he would perform for the rest of his life. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't know is Houdini never called it the Chinese water torture cell. He called it the upside down, and he did this on purpose as a way to obtain copyright protection for this trick. This man may have dropped out of school at 8 years old, but he was no dummy. And by this time, he is a total rock star. It could probably be argued that he was one of America's first ultra celebrities. And throughout the 19-teens, he's really at the peak of his career. The Chinese water torture cell trick was followed up by that famous trick where he's suspended from the crane and he's in a straitjacket and he gets out. Then it's followed by the overboard bots escape in 1912. This was basically a stunt where he was put in a packing crate, he was manacled and shackled. They nailed the crate shut, filled it with 100 pounds of lead, dropped it into the water, and he emerged 57 seconds later. They pulled the crate up and the manacles and the leg shackles or whatever were found intact, still inside the bots. Now, he actually had to perform this stunt from a tugboat because the New York City police wouldn't allow him to do it off of the pier. But that's another one of those tales where it's like, this is too dangerous to perform in the city. The police won't allow us to do it, so we have to do it out here. So let all the newspapers know, because you gotta build up the hype. He's always the performer, he's always the showman. Then in 1915, he does his first attempt at the buried alive stunt, and this stunt actually does almost kill him. The first time he attempts this stunt, the first variation, he's buried alive in a pit of dirt outside of Santa Ana, California, without a casket, and it's said that he's supposed to basically just claw his way to the surface. Now, this trick almost fails because during the attempt, while he's clawing his way up, he basically becomes exhausted and starts to panic as the weight of all this earth is basically crushing down on him. Now, when his hand does break the surface, he is pulled free by his assistants, but by this time he had already fallen unconscious. He then went to write in his diary that this escape was, quote, very dangerous, and that, quote, the weight of the earth is killing. After this, it's about 1916, he's still doing his vaudeville touring acts, and he's kind of organizing all these loosely affiliated magic clubs and stuff to join the Society of American Magicians, which he was a part of. In 1917, he's elected president of that society, and under him and his leadership, the growth of it explodes, and he would remain president of that society for the rest of his life. However, he really never gives up the kind of illusionary magic stuff. In 1918, he does that famous trick where he makes the elephant disappear. And this illusionary stuff is probably what led him to his kind of involvement with the film industry. Because in the film industry, not only are you promoting yourself, but you can make illusions happen. And it's around 1918 when he embarks on this kind of film career. In 1918, he signs on to star in a 15-part serial called The Master of Mystery. In 1919, he stars in The Grim Game, which basically is just a showcase or propaganda piece for all his escape artistry. It shows some of his more famous escapes, just, on film instead of in front of a live audience. Then in 1920, he stars in a film called Terror Island, where I think the plot is basically he's on an island and he uses his magic to escape the natives. I don't know, these early silent films were mostly basic in their plot lines. And after this little stint in Hollywood, he moves back to New York where he creates the Houdini Picture Corporation. It produces 2 films, one called The Man from Beyond, 1921, and another called Haldane of the Secret Service, 1923. However, the problem is these films weren't successful and the Houdini Picture Corporation basically collapses. In 1923, he says he's done with it. There's just not enough profit margin for him there. But by the 1920s, he has a new kind of target in his eyes, and that's the spiritualist movement. And it's really the second wave of the spiritualist movement, which got popular during World War I. And for this, we need a little bit of background. And a lot of this background involves his relationship with his mother. Now, Houdini, he absolutely adored his mother. He would always famously say he had 2 women in his life, his mother and Bess, his wife. And with his father dying at such a young age and him just being one of 7 children, had this great drive to kind of stand out and become the man and take care of his mother. He wanted to be like the man in his mother's eyes. I mean, to Houdini, his mother was absolutely everything. And in 1913, his mother tragically dies. But the show must go on. Now, we're not really sure about Houdini's specific religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, but he was of Jewish background, Jewish ancestry, and he did live during the emergence of spiritualism. And spiritualism, as we've discussed before, is kind of this mixture of the afterlife and science. It's really viewed through both of those lenses. And that heavy belief of spiritualism during this time is you could communicate with your deceased loved ones through all these different methods, and they were scientific or debunked or spooky or supernatural or whatever. And a lot of people back then and to this day truly believe in spiritualism. And it's pretty obvious why most people flock to and believe in spiritualism. It's that idea that your soul still lives on. That's comforting to a creature such as a human who is fairly frail and only has about a 110-year lifespan. So this was a religious movement, a scientific movement, and it possibly did influence Houdini after his mother's death. However, Houdini being a magician, he would easily be able to spot any kind of tomfoolery that the charlatan, psychics, and mediums, and I'm using the air quotes here, would come up with. But we really don't know. What we do know is spiritualism doesn't really become a focus in his life until pretty much after his mother dies, and it's not really until about maybe the late 19-teens or early 1920s when he really takes a hard focus on this. And that starts with one of his old friends, a man named Arthur Conan Doyle. You may have heard of his books or his character Sherlock Holmes. Now, what does the author of Sherlock Holmes have to do with this? Well, Arthur Conan Doyle, he was a spiritualist. He heavily believed in spiritualism. He believed this stuff as far back as the tail end of the first wave of spiritualism, which was still gaining in popularity throughout the 1870s and 1880s. And he was also involved in occultism. He was famously a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which you may remember from our Aleister Crowley episode. The man was loosely affiliated with Aleister Crowley. However, to be honest, I don't think he liked Crowley or if he was even aware of Crowley's existence. To be honest, Crowley wasn't very popular when it came to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but if you want to hear that story, go listen to the Crowley episode. So Arthur Conan Doyle, he is a lifelong spiritualist, and he's there during that second wave, which comes up during World War I. Now, there is kind of that false rumor out there that Arthur Conan Doyle became interested in spiritualism after his son was killed in World War I. And while his son did die in a hospital while convalescing from wounds in 1918, that wasn't the catalyst that got him into spiritualism. He'd been involved in spiritualism since nearly the beginning, so much so that he believed that his wife was a psychic medium, and they would famously hold seances where she would communicate with the dead through psychic writing, which I've discussed back in that Occult Tools episode. It basically evolves into the Ouija board. Go check that episode out too. So Arthur Conan Doyle, him and his wife, they are true believers of spiritualism. They're like, I guess you could compare them to Christian zealots today. No matter what you do or say, nothing will shake their beliefs. To them, this isn't a matter or a question of faith or evidence. This is simply just pure fact. So now that we've established that, what happens? Well, what happens is a series of events. Arthur Conan Doyle, he was a fan of Houdini, and he would constantly say that he believed that Houdini had supernatural help when it came to these feats, these tricks. And Houdini, he is a very matter-of-fact guy. He basically says, no, these are tricks. These are endurance tests. It's sleight of hand and illusion. And to be honest, he's probably a little bit insulted by this. He's like, don't diminish my feats and my tricks down to a bunch of psychic, ghostly nonsense. These are real skills that I can teach anyone. And in fact, in the past, Houdini had released several books about the art of illusion, the art of trickery, sleight of hand, how he does his feats. He writes these books in order to basically teach that new generation of magicians that are up and coming. But somewhere down the line, him and Arthur Conan Doyle, they're most likely having a discussion about spiritualism. And Houdini, being a magician, he obviously knew all the tricks of the spiritualists, especially the fraudulent ones. He could spot the sleight of hand and the assistants and the trick tables and whatever. I mean, he literally calls them cheap parlor tricks. And he knew a little bit about this because in those old rough and tumble days when he was on the circus circuit doing a lot of these cheap tricks, it said that him and Bess had performed some of these seances for paying customers. But Arthur Conan Doyle, he's not swayed by Houdini just saying that it's all bunk, dismissing it as all fraudulent. Doyle's like, sure, there are charlatans out there, but this is real science. This is real religion. My wife's a psychic medium. I tell you what, come to a seance and I guarantee you we can communicate with your mother. And Houdini, he's initially skeptical, but he obliges, and they go to this little hotel in Atlantic City and they perform this seance. So one night in this little hotel room in Atlantic City, Harry's there with Bess. Arthur Conan Doyle's there with his wife. I forget her name right now. I'm not going to go look it up. And they're sitting around the little table, and there's probably a crystal ball in the middle because there always is. And she's got her pad of paper out and her pen, and she goes into a trance and starts doing this psychic writing. And she scribbles out 15 pages of dialogue from Harry's mother. It's like, hi, how are you? I'm in the afterlife. It's fine. It's awesome here. We've been watching your career with great enthusiasm. Blah, 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 blah. However, it doesn't take old Harry long to realize that this is all a bunch of BS because of two main problems. For one, Harry's mother didn't speak English. At best, she spoke very bad broken English. She primarily spoke Yiddish and Hungarian. And this 15-page tirade was written out in perfect English. And two, at the top of every page, Conan Doyle's wife drew a Christian cross. And as we recall, Harry's mother was Jewish. She was married to a rabbi. So initially, Harry's just like, you know what? Fuck you, Conan Doyle. Fuck spiritualism. Fuck all those fakes and fraudsters out there. I'm going to go expose it all. And this kind of works out for him in his favor because, for one, he's a showman, he's a stage performer, he already has an audience. And secondly, debunking the fraudulent mediums out there, debunking these spiritualists, that's a new element he could add to his show. Because at this time in his career, by around 1920, a lot of his tricks and stuff had gone a little stale. By this time, the Chinese water torture cell is over 10 years old. And Harry, he's simply getting older. He's getting up there in age. At this point, he's about in his mid-40s. Even though he remains in the most peak physical condition he can, he's slowing down. This stuff is taking a hard toll on his body. So he essentially just ends up going on this crusade against spiritualism. And he goes around all the frauds and he'll disguise himself, or he'll send Bess out. And every city they performed in, he would send his team out to go figure out who all the psychics are in the area and the fraudulent mediums. And sometimes they would show up at the seances and expose all the tricks to everybody there and kind of ruin it for everybody. But more famously, what he would do is he would dedicate an entire act of his show to just exposing the fraud that the spiritualists were doing. He would expose all their tricks. And he would challenge these mediums directly, like his team ahead of the show. They would send out free tickets. Hey, come see Houdini. And at the shows, he would openly debate them, and he'd be like, well, prove to me that you're a psychic medium, and I'll prove to everybody else that you're a fraud. And this kind of reinvigorates his career at the end. And this battle gets so hardcore that they actually end up in the United States Supreme Court. And this all comes from where Harry and his guys, all these skeptics, they're trying to pass a law to basically ban these psychics from applying their craft, at least in Washington, D.C. And this exposed some political ramifications because a lot of presidents and first ladies, dating back to Lincoln, they were seeking the advice of psychic mediums, and it was believed that that advice was influencing the politics. And this doesn't go away in the aftermath of this. The last time we hear about it is when Nancy Reagan had her own personal astrologist on staff. But there's this, I think it's 6 days of hearings that go back and forth where Harry's just sitting there basically insulting these guys. And, these spiritualists, these mediums, they're just well, you know what? That's what I would expect from a dirty Jew. And it's dude, really? Yeah, you went there? At one point, they're attacking Houdini for being a Jew, and he says, well, your Messiah, Jesus Christ, he was a Jew too, but he didn't charge $2 a mission. And I kind of wish I could have been there because I heard it was a wild 6 days of hearings. It broke out in fistfights at some points. People were literally beating each other up in the halls of the Supreme Court building over this. And it's kind of sad that we don't have that kind of fire amongst our, politicians and judges and stuff today. They all seem to be a bunch of pansy, sober, crybaby sissies who are just in the pockets of whatever corporate entity they're sucking off at the moment. But I digress. Now, Harry and these guys, they don't really get their ban on psychic mediums practicing in D.C. passed or whatever, but he doesn't end his crusade. He remains on this tirade, and this stuff's being published about. It's being published in newspapers, and most famously, it's being published in places like Scientific American. That publication was offering a cash reward for anyone who could prove psychic ability without trickery. Now, one woman does get close to proving it, but ultimately, before she can, Houdini, he comes out with this big, long manifesto about exactly how she performs her trickery. And it's with all of this kind of showmanship, this bric-a-brac, where it kind of deals a heavy death blow to that second wave of spiritualism. Because after Houdini is done with at least the frauds, the whole idea kind of collapses in the public eye. People start to distrust the whole idea of psychic phenomena and communicating with the dead and etc., etc. It doesn't really emerge again until post-1960s during that kind of new wave of spiritualism and esotericism that kind of grew out of that hippie movement. And to be honest, the jury's still kind of out on whether or not he was just going after the frauds or if he was going after spiritualism as a whole. Because while going after the frauds, he does kind of dismantle that whole movement. But I think the events that took place after his death give us some kind of clue as to whether or not he really did have some belief in the idea. And for that, we really do have to talk about the circumstances around his death because it's very interesting. He dies at a young age. He was only 52, when he dies. So this is an entire story in and of itself. So it starts when he's touring in Montreal, and this is in October of 1926. Now, a few days after this incident, Harry had broken his ankle during a performance, and he's in his dressing room in the Princess Theatre in Montreal on October 22nd, and he's kind of reclining on the sofa, and 3 students come into the room and they give this account of what happened. So the students were Jock Price, Sam Simolovitz, and Jocelyn Gordon-Whitehead. And they come in, they're making small talk, and Houdini's just kind of reclining on this sofa. And according to the other 2, Whitehead asked Houdini something about if he believed in the miracles of the Bible, which is thought to be related to this spiritualist crusade he was on. But then he goes on to ask whether it's true that punches in the stomach did not hurt him. And this kind of comes from his strongman persona, that idea of having the iron gut or whatever. And Houdini gives this casual kind of reply that, well, my stomach can endure a lot. And when he offers that reply, Whitehead, he strikes him several times in the stomach. Now, the problem is this was a sucker punch, or a series of sucker punches. Houdini didn't have time to really get up and prepare and tighten his abs like one normally would in that situation. The guy just sucker punches him. And seeing Houdini wince at these blows, Price jumps in and basically pulls Whitehead aside and said, look man, you sucker punched him. You can't just go around sucker punching people or whatever. So throughout the evening, because the show must go on, Houdini performs and he's in great pain when he's performing. I mean, he's got a broken ankle and he's just been sucker punched several times. And it's believed that this sucker punching led to appendicitis. The jury's still kind of out on that. He might have been having acute appendicitis by this time and the blows just exacerbated it. Either way, the dude gets appendicitis. However, he refuses to seek any kind of medical help for the next 2 days. He's like, I'm Houdini, I can take this, I ain't no sissy, I don't need medical help. When they finally do convince him to seek medical help, they found out that he has 102 degree Fahrenheit or 39 degrees Celsius temperature and acute appendicitis, and the doctor advised him right then and there to have his appendix removed, have surgery. And Houdini, he ignores this. He knows that he has a show to do or a series of shows to do, and in his mind, no matter what, the show must go on. He's not going to disappoint his audience. So, on October 24th, 1926, he arrives at the Garrick Theater in Michigan, and this is where he does his last performance. He has a 104 degree temperature. At this point, his appendix has probably ruptured. He's sick as a dog. He goes out there, he does his first act, and it's total garbage. A person who had seen him perform many times before, who was in that audience, said, something's wrong, this isn't right, he doesn't look right. Now at this point, Houdini had created his own 3-act show. His first act was magic, his second act was escapism, his third act was the debunking the specialist. So he does his first act and it's total garbage, and he goes off to the stage and he passes out. However, they revive him. He goes out, he does his second act, he comes back, and he passes out again. After the show ends, he's immediately transported to Detroit's Grace Hospital, and they perform this abdominal surgery. However, it's too late. He literally lays there in pain after this surgery until October 31st, Halloween night. And Bess is there by his side. And it said that his last kind of words were to Bess, and it was this agreement that they had come up with. And this agreement stated that she would hold a seance, and if he were ever able to break through, she would know because he would send her this secret message that they came up with together, that only the two of them would know. Which begs the question, was he really a believer in spiritualism if they had come up with this pact? Or was this just kind of his last middle finger to all the frauds out there? Sadly, I think it's just kind of impossible to say. But what isn't impossible to say is Harry Houdini did die that night, Halloween night, October 31st, 1926, at the age of 52. His funeral was huge. It went through Times Square where thousands of mourners kind of lined the streets. And he was placed in this casket, and beneath his head were all the letters that his mother had ever written to him, because at the end of the day, even at the very end, he was that devoted to his mother. And for the next 10 years, on the anniversary of his death, Halloween night, Bess and others would hold a seance. However, his spirit has never broken through with that critical message. After 10 years, Bess said, 10 years is enough, and she kind of ended it. However, I believe it was in 1940, other people took up the task, and every Halloween night since 1940, people have gathered in a seance in order to try to contact Harry Houdini. And to this day, they state that he has never broken through. However, his legacy lives on to this very day. He influenced pretty much every modern magician you can think of. He created that larger-than-life idea of the celebrity magician, and he really embodied the American dream. He was a nobody from Hungary who came to America and made it huge. That was inspirational to people. It was probably inspirational to a lot of the fellow immigrants in his community. Now, yeah, he did kind of destroy the second wave of spiritualism and kind of set that movement back for about 40 years. But he really was instrumental in kind of ending a lot of that fraud that was going around. He was instrumental in challenging some of those beliefs which were probably based on some fraudulent claims. However, I'm not here to just trash spiritualism. I mean, I've been discussing it for 4 or 5 episodes now. I'll be honest, I'm not really sure because I recorded these out of order and this is the final one, but we'll figure it out. Because it's a fascinating movement that is so influential on the way that we view death to this very day. The way that we view hauntings and scientific research involving paranormal activity, it influenced all of that. And the movement really needed people like Harry Houdini who were kind of matter of fact, who were skeptical, who was able to expose fraud, because it did weed out a lot of the bad actors and the misconceptions who were just basically spouting bullshit. But that's really all I have on Harry Houdini, the greatest magician of all time. And that's probably good because I'm starting to lose my voice after all of these recording sessions. So, as always, this is Mike. I thank you for listening. Be sure to follow it on the socials, Instagram and Threads. That's where I'm primarily at. It's just Urban Legends and Mythology at Instagram and Threads. I don't really do Facebook anymore. Check out some of those reels that I've created, those like minute-and-a-half long kind of segments that are adjacent to this show. I'm doing 50 myths and or cryptids across the United States. There's already a bunch of reels up, so go check them out. And as always, follow it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, all those places. Wherever you're listening to it, give it those 5 stars, give it those likes. And you can always hit that link in the description of every episode, that support this podcast link, and throw me some beer money. You guys have no idea how much that helps the show out. But as always, if you don't want to do any of that, just tell a friend, because word of mouth is how this podcast grows. We are in 58 countries at the time of recording right now, and we have listeners in every state in America, and I want to keep growing that. So your word of mouth helps out a lot. So, once again, I truly do thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.